Hi, and welcome to my series called Behind the Scenes, where I'm sharing a creative process, the concepts behind it, and the tools I use to execute them. In this case, this project has never seen the light. It was commissioned by New York-based studio Porto Rocha, and it was part of a large presentation for a client. Some of the concepts were going to be developed by their in-house branding team, and a couple of concepts were going to be shown developed by an external lettering artist like myself. The project was for the cover of a catalog, and they wanted to see 6 hand sketches. Out of these 6 hand sketches, we were going to narrow them down to 3. And out of these 3, they wanted a very rough and very quick initial vectorization for them to create a mock-up and take part of the initial presentation to the client. The differences between working with a client directly and working with an in-house branding team is that the team you are working with have further knowledge into visual culture and visual communication. You don't need to develop your ideas so much because they are able to imagine the direction you are taking in. And it is a very different process because they are already literate in types of letter forms, types of meanings behind the letter forms, and they can envision what you're trying to create without having to develop the sketch so much. The importance of this video is 2 things. Firstly, showing you that sometimes very rough sketches are enough while you are working with a branding an in-house studio with an internal team. And the second one is that based on the 3 concepts, how I developed the iterations. So the 3 concepts they wanted to see coming from me was, number 1, a very festive spirit. They wanted to see something that was a celebration, maybe with the incorporation of ribbons or ribbon-inspired lettering. The second one is using something, it feels very familiar to us. It feels very friendly. We've seen it many times applied, something close to the spirit of an Adobe Caslon or Caslon swashes. And the third one is make it rebel, make it out there, a little bit more contemporary, maybe not so legible, with a lot of attitude. So these 3 ideas were the initial pillars for me to develop a few iterations. So I'm going to show you now my table, because part of this process, or more than half of this process, is developed with pencil and paper. So let's go. All right. The first idea that you are seeing in here, as you can see, is a very rough sketch, first of all, and it's based on the idea of an Italian-flavored Adobe Caslon typographic forms. So the lettering I have to be working with is our favorite things. And I know it's going to be applied on the cover of a catalog, so I have a portrait version. So I can decide if I want the title to be working in 2 or in 3 lines. And I'm starting to get familiarized with the typographic shapes of Caslon and understand where can I add extensions and customization. This is the very first sketch of the very first proposal, and then the first proposal starts to develop. Again, these are very, very quick sketches just to get a feeling. I know the branding team has a lot of typographic knowledge, so I know that they are going to understand the direction I'm slightly taking in just by showing them a few initial ideas. This is the second sketch of the first concept. And this is the third one. In here, I'm actually using the entire page, thinking that it's a very portrait version. And so I can use all this vertical layout. With that, I show this proposal to the client as one possible direction based on the Adobe Caslon very familiar, very friendly typographic approach. From here, I think, how can I turn this, that is mostly an italic, Roman italic shapes, into something that is slightly more script? So I'm going in here and I'm turning this into a connected script. So you see that the V connects to the O, now connects to a cursive R. the capital O connects to the U. I try to look if this is gonna work best in 2 lines, but I'm considering that I have a portrait layout. So maybe this is occupying not enough space. So I have to start looking at breaking this into 3 lines. If you look at the shapes from here, are not so different, but definitely there is a different flavor because now we are working with a lot more connections and a slightly stronger slant. And from here, I add a lot more contrast. So on the left-hand side is not the initial, but the previous sketch. And you see the contrast is much lower. And now in here, I decided to increase contrast. So you can still see that the endings are all round. I start to introduce almost like folded versions of the lettering and having a much more unique and less Adobe Caslon inspired letter forms. This is my concept number 1. And within the concept number 1, you already see that we have this variation in 3 lines, this variation in 2 lines, and this variation that it's a lot more portrait and a lot more typographically inspired. Okay. Next one. Okay, concept number 2, let me touch this. Concept number 2 is this is following this idea of make it a little bit more contemporary, make it a lot more out there with a big attitude. So I translated the whole sentence, our favorite things, into capital letters. They are very close to each other. I'm thinking of the graffiti environment a little bit more. I'm thinking in shapes that are not so easy to read, but they have a lot of attitude. So this is the very rough first sketch. And from here, I keep working on it. So I do it again. I try to understand what I'm doing better. I'm trying to make some of these letters a lot more simplified and see if this could work. Now, based on this idea, I want to introduce a bit more contrast and a bit more white into the lettering. So I think of the idea of what if I introduce the idea of a ribbon into this type of lettering? And in here, that's what I have. I have something that has more weight, that has a slight contrast. The terminals are all flat. Let's go in again. And maybe could be interesting to read or easier to read if it has a little bit more weight. So based on the second sketch, I showed the client, the second concept, I showed the client both the monoline and the slight increase of weight and contrast side by side so that they can see the 2 iterations based on the same idea. Okay. Concept number 3. All right, in here, I'm thinking of working with a script. I'm thinking of my knowledge of copperplate calligraphy, and I started sketching just the skeleton. Again, it's a very, very quick sketch. So I'm going with concept number 3, and from here, I'm starting to add a lot more contrast. So this is not so different from one of the iterations from concept 1. The difference is that now all the terminals are flat. I'm starting to work stronger with the idea of a ribbon, and if it's possible to introduce a 3D effect by shading. So the second iteration, now the lettering is turned into 3 lines. And in here you can see how I keep refining the shapes and thinking about the composition. Here I start to introduce shading. I'm thinking that maybe the client wants to see something a lot more obvious, that by introducing these typical endings of some of these ribbons and working with shading to express depth. This is the same sketch, a little bit more refined for me to understand what I'm doing. When I'm doing this type of work, I'm always sharing that for me it's very important to think with my brain and my hand at the same time. So the idea of creating rounds of hand sketches is because by the act of drawing is helping me to make decisions. So I'm thinking with my head and my hand at the same time. Based on this idea, I think that I'm not too sure about these terminals, because to me, this starts to look almost like like a fish tail, and I'm not too sure I'm into that. And so I create the next iteration with flat endings. So this is what I showed to the client with a couple of variations like this one, where you actually don't see the 3D effect, just the skeleton. So this and this are constitute part of my next concept. Now, next one and last one. So this one, again, no, it's not the last one. This is concept number 4. So this goes back to my script knowledge. I go back again to a very strong slant, and I consider if I can work on this without introducing any contrast at all. So that's the next iteration. So I'm starting to introduce white, but not contrast. And I think, what if I can create something that it's a little bit more unique? So it doesn't have as much personality as the second example, but there is something very unique about it without being a classical script. So I start to break the ductus and introduce some variations inside the shapes, like the H and the T ligature. There is also, the shapes have been broken into different parts. Now I'm thinking, okay, I still think I need to work on 3 lines. So from here, I go back to the initial sketch, but this time I'm going into a 3-line layout and introduce the ideas I have already taken. So starting with a very low contrast lettering, something that has flat terminals and is almost monoline, but not really. And then I keep on working on the same idea of breaking the ductus, breaking the strokes into different shapes. It's almost like a stencil variation, almost like where the kids use to learn the letter forms and get familiarized with them when you are at school at the very beginning of your learning curve with letters. So this is the first variation. I'm working on the S because I'm not too sure. It's a lot thicker than the other letters. I'm just working with the shapes and understanding if this can work. In here, I'm working with how can I turn this A into 2 completely separate strokes, if this is gonna work or not. From here, I do one more iteration and I keep looking at the letter forms, and I presented this as an option where we have a script with some odd or unique characteristics, and it's something that it's not a ribbon, but it's not far from ribbon. There is no high contrast. So that's my next concept. And now, yes, the last one. So the last one, it's more of a classic ribbon idea, and also introduction of depth and 3D effect by shadowing. So this is the first very rough sketch I created with a script ribbon, and then this turns into a more thought out ribbon. So if I go slightly out so you can see it a little bit more, this is sort of the idea. There is a clear element of a ribbon. There is a 3D effect through the ribbon going through behind and at front, and it works well as a very portrait variation with whatever else that they want to add in here. So based on everything I have shown you, the client selected this version. The client also selected this version, and with the possibility of going into these 3D effects. And the client also selected this version that I showed you now, where the lettering has been done with a very low contrast and almost, and also broken down the ductus of the lettering. So these 3 versions is what they chose. Now from here, I'm going to show you what happens in vector form. Excellent, let's go. So what I'm showing you now, it's what I presented to the client, which are black and white, very rough, very quick initial vectorizations for the internal team to create mock-ups for their very first presentation to the client. So let's go in here, and I'm gonna show you very, very quick rough vectorization. So this is the first concept that they approved. There is nothing refining here. All the curves are really like so out there, but that's enough for them to create a mock-up of the concept. Second one is this version where they have introduced, they wanted to introduce this sort of like ribbon, but not so obvious. And it has a lot of personality, it's very playful. I think it brings some sense of joy in the design. And concept number 3 is what I showed you earlier, this the more literal ribbon idea, and this is the vectorization. They asked me to introduce color just to make it more obvious how the design could turn from something 2D into something 3D. This is super quick, super rough initial idea. And as I mentioned, none of these designs saw the light because the client went with one of the proposals developed by their internal branding team. So I hope this video is helpful, and I'll see you again in another one soon.